All right, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky, and this is Sam. We are your hosts for today's exciting program on near-death experiences and irrefutable evidence for life after death. If you are a skeptic of near-death experiences, this program might just change your mind. And it is a real privilege to have Dr. Steve Miller here with us for this valuable program. For the past decade, Dr. Miller has explored the topic of near-death and deathbed experiences extensively. I can tell you this is going to be an informative, thought-provoking program. Now, before we get into our discussion, which I am really looking forward to, I do want to hand it to my award-winning co-host, Sam, to give a formal introduction to our guest. Sam, over to you, brother.
Yeah. Donny, thank you very much. So I'm also looking forward to this valuable program. So Steve is an educator. He teaches in the Interdisciplinary Studies Department at Kenshaw State University. He's a researcher, entrepreneur, and speaker, having taught in audiences from Atlanta to Moscow. He studied at Dalton State College, the University of Georgia, Columbia International University, where he got his BA, Trinity Divinity School, Southwestern Seminary for his master's in divinity, and Columbia International University Graduate School, where he got his PhD. His current research writings obsession is afterlife, apologetics, deathbed experiences, and near-death experiences. He is known from drawing practical wisdom from serious research and communicating in an accessible way and unforgettable ways. His wife, Sherry, and their sons continually challenge his thinking. I'm glad you're here, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Sam, appreciate that. Steve, again, it is a privilege to have you here for this program on a truly fascinating topic, near-death experiences. And you've studied this topic extensively. So you are the right brother in the Lord to be here for this discussion. Before I ask you the first question, though, I do want to encourage people to utilize the links that we have in the description box and also in the live chat here. And so we have your website and the Amazon link where people can check out your books, including your latest book, from my understanding, is Christianity Compatible with Deathbed and Near-Death Experiences. And so, Steve, my brother, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
Doing good. Doing good. Okay, let's get right into it. We got a lot to discuss, Steve, as it is it's a large topic. And for those that are skeptics in our chat today, as I said earlier, I think this program is really going to help towards changing your mind, or at least giving you guys something to think about. And so what I'd like to do, Steve, is set the foundation for the discussion. For those who might be unfamiliar with an NDE, what is an NDE, or near-death experience? And can you tell us or take us through a journey through your experiences in this fascinating topic, Steve?
Sure. Well, in brief, a near-death experience is a seemingly spiritual experience where a person who is near death, where we would describe that as, for example, someone has a cardiac arrest, they experience cessation of breathing and cessation of heartbeat, what we call clinical death, and then they come back. You shouldn't be able to lay down memories or have any kind of conscious experience during that time, but if they're resuscitated, they often come back with an experience of hyper reality, hyper consciousness that they tell, and it just seemed real as or even realer than real to them. It has it has some aspects of it that are consistent across cultures, no matter whether you're an atheist or a theist or a Buddhist or Hindu or whatever. There are common commonalities to each of these experiences, which wouldn't be expected under naturalism, such as you feel like you've come out of your body, you're looking down on your body, you can tell about things that are going on during this time of clinical death in the operating room or wherever you are near the car accident, whatever caused your near-death experience. You'll talk to angels and deceased loved ones, maybe have a life review, go through a tunnel. And then there's some totally unexpected things. A lot of those things are unexpected according to your worldview. You're expecting none of this if you're an atheist, of course. But things like talking to people, typically mind to mind rather than listening to them. Time seeming to disappear. These are things nobody's expecting. Why would that be consistent across cultures? So that's the near-death experience. I also studied deathbed experiences, which are similar experiences, but they happen around the time of a person's final death, where they may be talking about visiting again with deceased relatives or angels or God. And so these are all fascinating. I used to be very skeptical of them. I guess you asked me about my background. 15 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that there was anything to these experiences. I'd gone through a lot of periods of doubt and questioning early in my life. During high school, I made a commitment to Jesus as a sophomore in high school because I went on a retreat because a girl I liked was going, and I met Jesus there, changed my life. But after then, I began to go through periods of doubt as I had to think through the challenges people were posing from evolution, from contradictions in the Bible, and so many things that I had to answer. So my academia career, the reason I went to so many schools is I was trying to study out these issues, and I wanted to hear from the skeptics exactly what they were teaching at the University of Georgia, for example, or other places, and make sure that I understood all sides of them. So I studied a lot about evidences for the Christian faith. Really appreciate what you guys are doing, because this is the type stuff that really kept me in the faith over the years. But it wasn't until about 12 or 13 years ago when a relative gave me the little book, Heaven is for Real, that was made into a movie, and a little boy had a pastor's son had claimed to have had a near-death experience, and a relative wanted me to read that. I read it, and I thought, well, I don't see a ton of strong evidence for a skeptical mind like mine that this really happened, because after all, they did publish a book on it. There's the money incentive. I don't know the family. They sound very sincere. But I saw on the book there was a blurb where a physician, Dr. Long, said, I've studied thousands of these experiences, and this is consistent with what I've found. And I thought, somebody's been studying these experiences. It's not just tales going over the internet. I need to get into the studies, and was shocked I had not seen them before. And I found there'd been a wealth of study done since 1975 on near-death experiences, and since the late 1800s on deathbed experiences, which is what I did my dissertation on. So this is truly new to me, fascinating. Now I've written on it extensively, but before then I was a skeptic like so many others, saying this is just a personal experience. What possible evidence could this be for other people?
I appreciate that detailed answer, Steve. I have a similar personal scenario to you, where I came at this as a skeptic, but after looking into it, seeing what people like you have to say about it, John Burke, I'm more convinced than ever. And so it's a blessing, your research, brother, into this. Sam, you had a question?
Yeah, I'd love to. So similarly, I was also skeptical. There's passages like Donny mentioned earlier. To be absent with the body is to be present from the Lord, for example. It's kind of a taboo topic within Christianity. As far as your research goes, though, I guess the question that I would be asking is, so you have all of these unconnected cultures around the world that have their own idea of what a deity might be, and they have an experience, and they come back, and they might, I guess, misapply the name of their deity to this experience, or are they correctly applying it? So are these experiences consistent with the belief systems and the other cultures, or would you say that there's a a specific theistic worldview that would explain this I don't know, this experience more than anyone else?
Good question. And by the way, you said you're skeptical because of certain biblical passages. I'd say
Yeah.
there are two main groups of people who really resist this, and that's the Christian believers and atheists, because the atheists are concerned that, oh my goodness, I don't really think there's an afterlife. Typically, a lot of atheists actually believe in the afterlife. They just don't think there's a God there. And then you have some people who are Christians who are afraid that this is going to conflict with their theology.
Right.
So I think it's important to look at the cross-cultural impact of these, both with near-death and deathbed experiences. And fortunately, a lot of studies have been done globally. So yes, as you say, let's say that you're growing up in India. There are many different versions of Hinduism there. And so I teach world religions. And so if your version of Hinduism believes that Krishna, for example, is the highest God, or maybe you have some other name for the highest God, if you have a near-death experience, you may say, I saw Krishna. Or if there was a God of death and you saw God on the other side, you would assume that's the God of death, right? And so same thing with a Muslim. If you had a near-death experience, your word for the highest God is Allah. So naturally, you're going to say that you met Allah on the other side, but I don't see any contradiction between that and a Christian saying that they saw God on the other side, because that's simply what we're calling the highest God. So that in itself is not a contradiction. I really see that typically near-death experiences don't go into great depth in theology, getting into a lot of specifics. And I think this is biblical. Think of the Apostle Paul. He was out persecuting Christians. He has this vision on the Damascus Road. He didn't get the whole gospel in a nutshell.
Right.
He was just said, Jesus said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Well, he knew it was Jesus. He knew this was a vision, but he didn't give him the whole story. And Jesus didn't tend to give the whole story. Think about it. Even when people were talking to him about salvation matters, he would say things like, go sell all you have and give to the poor. And I'm like, now, wait a minute. Why don't you tell them about you need faith in Jesus and all this and that? I believe that in such encounters, typically God is giving us enough to say there's something more to life. Materialism isn't all there is. There is another side where there's spiritual beings. And you know what? What's important isn't what you thought was important. It's things like love. And that sets you on a course, if you're willing to accept it, to become a seeker. And we know that Jesus said, if you seek, you'll find. Seek and keep on seeking, it is the implication in the original Greek. And so it's not giving them the whole picture, but it's giving them enough of the picture to say, wow, this is worth searching, and I need to seek for God.
Donny,
Amen.
if you don't mind, just a quick follow-up. But like during these experiences, we would expect that perhaps if Hinduism is true, truth is objective. So there can only be one true state of affairs. And so it seems like, if they believe that they would be seeing like a blue deity, for example, and that's not there, or maybe their theistic framework would think that, they would be surrounded by their multiple virgin wives or something like that. Are these the types of things that they're experiencing? Christianity, on the other hand, we have a being that is a loving being, and a description of a heavenly realm, and an alternative, like a hellish type realm. So are they experiencing all of these or none of these? Or I guess that would be my question.
I can't recall right off anyone saying that they saw a blue deity, for example, or something that represents exactly what they think of from the paintings of their gods, that would be kind of a niche look for a god. Now, if you look carefully enough, there are thousands and thousands of these experiences that people are reporting out there. And so if you're looking into niche experiences, you can find some of almost anything. You'll see people that say that they saw Elvis on the other side, and hey, maybe they did. He's dead somewhere. And so, but we can't accept all of those because we have all kinds of people submitting experiences. Some people have written a book on their experience, and maybe they're trying to appeal to a certain demographic and would want to make it more acceptable to people that are wanting to buy their books. So you have that motive in there. You have some people who have mental illness. Some were in very desperate straits and may have had a true near-death experience, but also had a hallucination, and they got them confused. I know a person who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, somebody I knew personally, and he would give what sounded like a very valid near-death experience, but then he would start talking about all the other near-death experiences he had had, and then his messages from God, and I realized, okay, he's got mental illness, and yet he was interviewed on a talk show. He was a chapter was on him in somebody's book. And I said they need to know that this guy had mental problems and he was not on his meds. So you can find almost anything you want. So what I look for and what my purpose was to study is, let's look at the best studies of near-death experiences that were done by physicians who could actually check the records. They could check for, is this person mentally stable? Do they have ulterior motives for saying things that weren't true? What actually happened if they're claiming to have seen things when they were clinically dead and they saw them in the hospital room? Who else might have been there? What nurses may have been there? What do the hospital records say? So by staying with these that didn't really have a great motive to be lying, then I think I'm getting a clear view of what are the common characteristics, so that we don't get off into the 1% of experiences that we really ought to set aside as anomalous, because we're not seeing those in great numbers.
I appreciate that response, because, and Sam, you're familiar with this as well. The main objection or challenge I see from the naturalists or the skeptics, which we deal with here at Standing for Truth, is, well, what about all the Hindus or people of other religions that have a near-death experience and they see a version of their deity? But as you're conveying, there are niche experiences or niche stories that we should be considering all of the stories as a whole. And at the top of your head, you can't think of any certain instance where somebody's seen a blue deity or something real specific to Hinduism. So are they in many ways?
Well, what I would say is, let me correct a little, because when you get into the anomalous experiences, the 1% and less, you'll have somebody who says, "Oh, I went to the other side and I saw the Christian God, and I saw Krishna, and I saw Muhammad, and I saw whatever." And so, but because you have all these different groups of people submitting things, those are the type that I say, okay, well, that's 1% or less that are saying anything like that.
Right.
What we need to look at are, what are the core things that shouldn't be there if these things were just based on people's expectations. And the core is very, you'll find 20% of the people saying that they maybe saw a tunnel on the other side when they got there. It's not that everybody has all the elements. Some person may go on the other side and talk to some angels and then come back, but they do feel like they were outside of their body. So they have several of these elements, but not all. But then when you get into things like somebody who saw multiple deities, that's such a small percentage that you say, that's really anomalous, and I don't need to take that seriously in light of the core experience.
Are those exceptions to, I guess, exceptions to the rules then, Steve, rather than the rule, which is what you're describing, all the things that we have in common with these near-death experiences, and then these niche experiences, which are just a small percentage. Really,
it's like a medical researcher studying Tylenol. Somebody takes the Tylenol and then dies.
Right.
And so you don't put that up as, okay, here's what tends to happen when you take Tylenol. That's not the common experience. And so you set aside those very small percentages as anomalous, but you want to look at them further to see if there's anything to them. Maybe Tylenol does kill a certain person who is in a certain state. So you want to consider those, but you don't put that up there as a typical result of taking Tylenol.
Yeah, if it was the overwhelming majority of people that saw, like a blue deities with multiple arms, or
Right.
surrounded by virgins, maybe, or they're just everything just kind of blends into the oneness of nirvana. If that was the central experience, then that would be probably problematic for us.
Yes, it
But
would be.
yeah,
And I'd question those. Now, also, we've got to realize as Christians that we do believe there are malevolent forces on the other side as well as benevolent. And
Yeah.
so there can be deceptions going on. And we know that's a part of Satan and demons' nature, is they're deceivers and they want to imitate what God has done. That's why the Apostle Paul in Galatians 1 says, if an angel comes to you and gives you a gospel other than the one I gave to you, let him be accursed, because we believe that there are malevolent beings on the other side who may try to imitate it and give out false doctrine. So from a
Okay.
Christian standpoint, we'd expect there to be a certain percentage of experiences that come against the Christian faith, or that say that all faiths are just the same, or no religions matter, So yeah, there are those out there, but we would expect them from a Christian position, and even a secular position. We would expect those because of the various mental illnesses, as I say, and false motives and other things that come into play.
Dr. Miller, what are the central characteristics, the most common characteristics or traits of these near-death experiences that help us to come to the conclusion that this is the Christian God, this is the God described in the Bible?
Well, think about it. And a lot of the researchers don't even want to go there, because these are not typically people from seminaries. In fact, I don't know any of these teaching at a seminary, or that before they were studying near-death experiences were really strong Christians and were out to make this into some apologetic. They're typically people who are university professors, who are researchers, or they're people who are were cardiologists, so this was relevant to their field, and they just found this fascinating experience. They said, we've got to check into this and see what this is all about. So there's a strong tendency in that intellectual sphere not to try to tie this into any specific worldview. They want to be tolerant to all worldviews, and they'll just talk very much in general about, it seems like the evidence is pointing toward these people being actually out of their bodies and this being legitimate. But when I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, I want to know more, I want to know what worldviews fit best with this experience. Once I began to say this is there are a lot of evidences that this is authentic, which we can go into later. If it is authentic, what does this tell us? Well, they're not just separating from the body, but they're coming out, and when they have a life review, for example, it's typically they're seeing themselves, sometimes like a panoramic view. Sometimes they're seeing their deeds and their words from the perspective of how other people were affected when they said or did these things. What's the big thing? How they express love or how they did not express love, which really jives together with what Jesus said when he was asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he said, love God, love people. If you want to boil it all down, here's the big thing. And so sure enough, these people are seeing themselves, their lives reviewed in the light of how they loved other people. Well, that's not taught in all worldviews. I mean, you look at the basis of some of the worldviews about that everything that counts is really about getting the economics straightened out, and you see the basis of communism and others where it was all about, okay, let's we've got to get this world economically straightened out. Well, that's not even mentioned in the life reviews. It's all about those individuals, but people will justify doing terrible things to people in the name of some future world that they're trying to put together. So that's inconsistent with that. And there's certain religions that are really not all about love and loving the people around you and loving everyone particularly. That seems unique to Christianity, and yet people going to the other side consistently say they met a God that was overwhelmingly love.
Right.
Yet you look in Islam, I've read through the entire Quran, just read it kind of devotionally over a period of 4 months. It really says very little about love. If you see the word love in the Quran, it's typically to say God does not love people who are like this. God does not love people who reject Muhammad. God does not love certain ones. And yet in a near-death experience, it seems like the godly and the ungodly report seeing a very loving God, which to me is consistent with what people in New Testament times saw when they met Jesus. The woman at the well, she had a very horrid past as far as her morality.
Yeah.
And yet he acted toward her in love. Wow, where does that come from? That's very consistent with Christianity. Worldviews that don't believe in a personal God. A lot of the Eastern worldviews will talk about going to nirvana, but there's no real personal God over there. Well, in a near-death experience, it's not just that they see God, but he's a person. He's someone that you talk to and communicate with and that knows you and your life. So to me, the aspects and what I found is probably 20%, 17 to 20% of the NDEs on the NDERF site, which where people turn these in, contain Jesus. Very few contain Muhammad. Most Muslims will admit this, but so I think it's very consistent with Christianity, very inconsistent with a lot of other worldviews. And that was the topic of my book: is Christianity compatible with deathbed and near-death experiences? Let's compare not just all this stuff you hear over the internet about near-death experiences, but let's take the best studies of near-death and deathbed experiences and compare them to biblical studies and Christian theology.
Now, I'm curious, Dr. Miller. A lot of Christians that remain skeptical over near-death experiences, they'll quote several passages in the Bible. One of them is Hebrews 9:27, where it says, "And it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment." But I'm wondering, are these near-death experiences more of a sneak preview into the afterlife as compared to what a passage like Hebrews 9:27 is saying about that death in its final state, I guess, would be my question, Steve?
I think that's one of the main problems Christians have, is that we're thinking in terms of what the Bible teaches will happen after our final death. And so we're saying, oh, well, you ought to go, everybody ought to go to the other side and encounter God or Jesus telling us whether we're getting into heaven or whatever our picture of that is. And yet people are talking about going on the other side, talking to deceased relatives. It's very unexpected from a Christian standpoint. And you should, if you have a car wreck and you're just about to go out and you can tell you're dying, what you're expecting is what's going to happen in final death. But if you're resuscitated, that wasn't your final death. So this is not this is not after the fourth quarter. This is a halftime experience, which is different. So that's why Christians and non-Christians and atheists and everybody aren't really expecting this series of things to happen. Maybe now that it's gotten so popular, somebody could say, okay, maybe they're expecting it now, but surely not 1975 when Moody first published his book on near-death experiences and exposed them to the world. But I think we need to deal with that word death, because in the Hebrews passage, when he's talking about you die and then after this comes the judgment,
Right.
That's speaking of a final death, obviously there. But if you're saying from that passage, therefore anybody that dies is going straight to the judgment, and therefore near-death experiences are wrong. Well, wait a minute. Look at Jesus when he was, before he raised Lazarus from the dead, he told them outright, Lazarus is dead. Well, he didn't mean final death, because he was going to raise him from the dead and he would have another final death, right? So sometimes in the Bible, the word death, I think it's consistently thanatos in the Greek, refers to a temporary death. Sometimes it speaks of the final death, and I think we have to distinguish those. And once we do, a lot of those questions clear up. I don't see anything unbiblical about the core experience of a near-death experience. They see angels, okay. You see deceased loved ones. Well, let's see Jesus in his in his transfiguration, he taught the long deceased Moses and Elijah. So
Right.
I can't say that that's unbiblical all the time. You see Stephen having a vision at his deathbed, which would be a deathbed vision, which is a type of deathbed experience. I think visions are all through the Bible. So I don't see anything anti-biblical about the core experience. But I think that Christians do need to get in their mind, this is a visionary experience that happens during life. It's not what's going to happen after our final death, and it's certainly not the new heavens and new earth that comes at the end of the age.
I like the way you put that. It is a halftime experience. And that was a fantastic answer with some excellent points.
Right after the
Steve.
Super Bowl, very appropriate.
Right, exactly. It's like we planned it. So I'm curious. I've watched several of your interviews, and you've gone over what I believe are irrefutable reasons based for near-death experiences, the validity of them, based on some of these stories that you've heard and then conveyed to others. And so my question would be, what are some of the best near-death experiences stories that you've come across, Steve?
I'd probably put it a little different way. I wouldn't say it was because of individual stories as much as it's the result of very good studies of numerous examples.
Hmm.
Because if you make it all depend on a couple of wild stories, then people like Michael Shermer are going to say, okay, there are billions of people in the world. Surely somebody is going to have a death experience in a cardiac arrest, and they're going to describe everything in detail.
Right.
But you know what? There are all kind of weird things happening out there. So I tend to not base it on the individual experiences, but the best people studying that. And can I give you one example of one of the studies?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. So this would be Michael Sabom. He wrote a book. I keep my books back here in case I forget the titles and the authors. I can just pull them out. But he wrote a book called Recollections of Death. Now, Dr. Sabom, and I actually know him. He doesn't live that far from me. We get together occasionally. But his entire adult life, he's been studying these things because it just kind of came out of nowhere and hit him when he was early in his career as a cardiologist. And he would teach cardiology at Emory University, which is a very, very well respected medical university. And so very sharp guy. He was exposed by a nurse to the book Heaven is not Heaven is for Real, but Life After Life by Raymond Moody, published in 1975. I believe it was that same year when she was doing a seminar he attended. She said, okay, here are these near-death experiences that he reports. Michael Sabom says the kindest thing that I could think to say was, I don't believe it. And he said, looking back, I just thought it was what I call hogwash. It was just nothing to this. And he told her that he didn't believe it. And she said, well, you're a cardiologist. Why don't you talk to your patients? He said, none of my patients have experienced this type thing. So, but she said, well, interview them. And I think it was his second or third patient that he interviewed told him about this wild near-death experience that was consistent with what Moody had reported. So he thought there surely must be some kind of naturalistic explanation. This is just some kind of hallucination that's experienced by somebody who's near death. So he set it up very scientifically. He took patients that had experienced clinical death in a cardiac arrest, and he asked them, if you came out of your body and looked back and saw things going on, tell me what happened, because resuscitations are not the same way all the time like you see on TV. So he asked them what happened during a resuscitation. They told him. He compared it to the physician's records. He looked at other people who had seen it. And sure enough, every time they got it right to the detail. I mean, of this person that was in the room, what they looked like, details that you couldn't have just known. Then he had a control group of patients who had experienced cardiac arrest and but did not report a near-death experience. So he said, what if these other people are really getting it from TV and it just kind of, that's the way they're describing what happened. So in this control group, he asked them the same question. What do you think happened during your resuscitation? They always got it wrong in major details. And so he said, after about a year of study, he determined these people came out of their bodies. That's the only explanation for how this could be. Now, he was not writing a popular book. It's very detailed as he goes through, thinking it through very rationally, very scientifically. Van Lommel in Holland had the same experience. He worked with his patients and got them from several hospitals, the reports, compared them just as Sabom did, came up with the same solution. These people must have left their bodies because of this evidence. And so they concluded that these things were real. These are very good studies. They're not quick reads, very thoughtful. And that's what convinced me. But I'd have to say the things that have been most convincing to me, they have some dramatic testimonies to share. There are lots of evidential near-death experiences out there. I was just reading from Gary Habermas' recent book on the resurrection. His first appendix is, I don't know, 40 or so pages, but it's on evidential near-death experiences, and he documented over 300 evidential near-death experiences. So these are not just a few. But what really shocked me, and that I was totally not expecting at all, since 4% of the population of the United States in large surveys will say that they've had a near-death experience. They've also done this survey in Australia and Germany. It's between 4 and 6%. Well, that's 1 out of 25 people. So what I wasn't expecting was that, hey, this means that people around me that are already within my circles of trust are probably having some of these experiences. And so I was at my mother's house. I was taking care of elderly relatives next door. I was with my mom, and she said, tell your cousin Bucky here, who had stopped by for a visit, tell him what you're studying. I said, near-death experiences. And he said, oh, I've had 3 of those. And I said, really? Now, it turned out they really weren't near-death experiences. 2 of them were angelic visitations, which were quite dramatic. But Bucky is a person that I know from my family, from family get-togethers. A history major, got a master's in history, taught history all of his life, very well respected within the family. I know that he doesn't have mental illness. He's not trying to sell his book on the subject. Why would he be making something up? But he said, here's one that happened to me. One night, 3 o'clock in the morning, I suddenly felt like something huge had landed on my chest. I popped out of my body, looked down, saw my body below me, saw a tunnel in the corner of the room, talked to some angelic beings, came back into my body, woke up immediately in a cold sweat because this had never happened to him before. Okay. This is not like a regular thing that happens. It wakes up in a cold sweat. Immediately the phone rings, and it's a nurse from hours away saying that his dad had just died of a massive heart attack. And his dad had not been sick. He had not been in the hospital, totally unexpected. How do you explain that timing? Yes, a person may have a dream of the parent passing away, but that timing is remarkable. Now, a big study was done by some professors at Cambridge University and in the Cambridge and Oxford area. William James was a part of it as well, where they surveyed 17,000 people in the community and found that about 10% of them reported seeing someone who was not there. About 4% of the population that they surveyed were saying, and that was, you know, a smaller percentage than the 10%, but like 4% of that, of the 10%, the 4% were crisis apparitions where they had an experience with someone who had just died and seemingly appeared to them dramatically to kind of say their goodbyes before the person left. Well, it's not just Bucky. Bucky can't just be one out of a billion, but this was happening in numbers such that the people from Cambridge said, you know, that it's like one times this is like 400 times as many people experiencing this as you would expect to happen if it were just a chance event. So this is quite remarkable. When I had people that I knew and trusted, and this keeps happening, if you start talking to your friends and family about what you're studying, you're going to start finding these within your circles of trust. And even in academia, people that I thought were totally secular. I'd be in an academic situation where master's degree students get together and professors, and my wife would say, tell them what you're studying. Inevitably, somebody pulls me aside and says, Steve, come out here in the hall and let me tell you about something. You get out there and they'd say, you know, when I was 9 years old, I drowned, and this was my near-death experience. Tell me what you think of that.
Wow.
Totally secular situations. No reason for them to be lying to me. Every reason for them not to share it with me. These are the ones that have astounded me the most.
Yeah, you made a really good point when you said that you wouldn't really want to focus on a few specific experiences. Again, you pointed to the greater body of evidence. And I was going to ask you about what those statistics are. I think you said somewhere around 4% in some groups, 6% in other groups of people that are reporting it.
Near-death experiences.
Yeah. And so in a world where there's about 7 billion people, that's about 350 million at 5%. Like that's a lot of people.
We're talking about millions of Americans.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, but again, you know, perhaps somebody might say, all right, you know, maybe there is some naturalistic mechanism. You know, the brain does weird things. So what would be, how would we rule that out? I mean, what is the nature of these experiences that people have? And then, and when we're calling somebody medically dead, we mean there's no energy at all inside their brain. They're flatlined. Is that what we mean? So they're medically dead, and then they have an experience. And so how would we know that these experiences aren't just some strange brain phenomenon?
Sure. Well, within about 20 seconds or so of cessation of heartbeat and breathing, I mean, basically your brain function just quickly dives. So you wouldn't experience any kind of vivid experience during that 20 seconds. It's going down. You're getting less vivid. You're passing out, right? So the very fact that you're having this experience when your brain should be basically dead is saying there's something else going on here. But let me pull out one more book, for example. This is Bruce Grayson, and he had an experience early on in his career. Psychiatrist, taught through the years at the University of Virginia, Department of Perceptual Studies. This is his book after. He's retired now, but his entire life he was studying these experiences. So if you look through it chapter by chapter, he's going through each of these naturalistic suggestions as to what could explain these and showing why research through the years showed that these didn't fit with the experience. For example, you've got anoxia, a lack of oxygen that's happening during clinical death. But some people had experiences where they were not lacking oxygen. The oxygen levels were being tracked and they did not and had these. Besides, lack of oxygen, even if you had some kind of brain activity going on, how is that going to explain Dr. Sabom's experience with actually being able to verify what people had seen. Is lack of oxygen going to help you to actually see something outside of yourself? And then you've got people that have had experiences where they were actually in a surgery and everything was being monitored, like the Pam Reynolds case. Dr. Sabom he wrote a second book on this, and he had heard about the Pam Reynolds case and went in to study it. He heard this from another physician who said, hey, if you're studying this stuff, you need to check into the Pam Reynolds case. So Pam Reynolds' situation was that she had a problem, a bulge in one of her veins in her head, and in order to repair it, it was going to require a very risky surgery that really very few specialists could do. But they would lower your body temperature down to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit and drain all the blood from her head so that when they repaired this vein, she wouldn't bleed out into her brain. But during that time, her heart was stopped. She was not breathing. She was clinically dead. And they were monitoring it through her brainstem activity, as well as an EEG, a silent EEG, no blood going through the brain. And during this time, she had a very vivid near-death experience. And she was able to describe some of the unique instruments that were being used. Now, lack of oxygen can't explain that. How could she see these things? I mean, her eyes were taped shut. She had 100 decibel inserts in her ears that they were clicking so that they could monitor the brainstem activity. How could she have known these things? Her whole body was covered except for the point where they were doing the surgery. I'd like to mention a couple of other things because there are a lot of theories, and we ought to put out all these hypotheses and explore them.
Right.
Lack of oxygen. What about latent brain activity that may be going on even during clinical death? Maybe there's a little something going on there. Research all these things. Maybe it's some special kind of hallucination that's built upon our expectations. So all these different naturalistic hypotheses have been studied through the years and compared to the evidence, so that when you compare the dying brain hypothesis to the afterlife hypothesis in order to explain it, to me, the afterlife hypothesis is the only one that's left, that this was some kind of authentic experience. Because, number one, okay, my cousin Bucky, you can't explain that as a hallucination or anything regarding the dying brain because his brain wasn't dying. And some of these experiences, especially in deathbed experiences, they weren't happening to the dying. So lack of oxygen, hallucinations due to a dying brain are just not explanatory of the experience.
That's a great answer. And you touched on a lot there in terms of questions I had, because I hear the skeptics, people like Michael Shermer, who you mentioned earlier, they'll talk about that these experiences could be due to chemicals being released from the brain, or something similar to DMT is going on at death, hallucinations. But if I'm understanding you correctly here, Dr. Miller, these explanations simply don't work. And the only really good explanation, in light of all of the evidence, all of the data that's been accumulated, is that this really is an experience in the afterlife.
Yes, that's my conclusion. You need to go through those studies to actually come to that conclusion. But I believe it was Bruce Grayson who said one time that naturalistic explanations of near-death experiences look pretty good as long as you ignore all the evidence for the supernatural. In other words, if you're just talking about somebody having a certain experience while their brain seems to be dead, well, some of these sound like they're pretty good, but then how do you explain how they actually saw people on the other side?
Right.
How do you explain them seeing people on the other side that they did not know yet were dead?
Right.
That's a common experience. How do people then, when you get into deathbed experiences like terminal lucidity, in Michael Shermer's book, he says, okay, I can tell you how we know that death is just something natural, and that the brain is is totally tied up to mental activity is because when you have a disease like Alzheimer's or meningitis or a brain that's actually eating away the brain, as you die, you don't get better. You get worse, you go comatose, and then you die. But studies of terminal lucidity show people with these very diseases, these very ailments, and their brain is being eaten away. They've been comatose. And then suddenly they become perfectly lucid, say their goodbyes to their families, maybe get something right that had been wronged, and then suddenly pass away. How did they know it was time to die?
Right.
It's not like, how did they become conscious at all and lucid in a state like that? So those are just not explained by the naturalistic theories. And then you go beyond that and look at people who are born blind. A whole book was written on this study.
Yeah.
But people that were blind, that were born blind, and you'd say, well, what do you see? Do you see just black? And they said, no, I don't see black. I don't see white. I don't see anything. I don't have any memories of any pictures, and yet they would have a near-death experience and explain and describe their surroundings. So
Wow.
I've got like 12 lines of evidence that we've just talked to maybe 3 of them here, but about 12 lines of evidence that I think are very much more consistent with the afterlife hypothesis than the dying brain hypothesis. That's for near-death experiences, about the same number for deathbed experiences.
I appreciate how comprehensive you are, Steve. And so how do the naturalists explain these kinds of stories where people who have died, gone to the other side, and they can explain what happened to their body while maybe surgery was being performed on them? Or how do the naturalists explain how these people would know what's going on? And are there stories where people would know what's going on in another room or in a totally other building? I'm curious if you could speak to that, Dr. Miller.
Yeah, I think we're looking for an objection that you probably hear and a refute to that objection, because we anticipate getting some of those.
Sure. Well, the DMT thing that you mentioned earlier, some people will compare DMT experiences with near-death experiences and say, well, then they'll make the hypothesis that maybe the brain squirts off some kind of a DMT-like substance when you're at death, and that would explain the experience. Now, of course, that doesn't explain how you know what's going on in the hospital room and all these things. But
Right.
let's, for the sake of argument, say, yes, that's something that comes up often. Or that there's some kind of latent brain activity, which people will give all kinds of objections. With each of these objections, you really need to go into the counter objections to those to see where people have actually done the research. And if you go far enough into the research, you'll see very satisfying answers. There's a book by Carter, Science and the Near-Death Experience. It was one of the best I'd seen on going back into the actual research pertinent to all these naturalistic explanations. But DMT, number one, latest article I read said, well, there really isn't any evidence that the brain does secrete something like that. It's just a hypothesis that's been thrown out there. Some people have said, well, maybe that could explain it. But I saw 2 very good peer-reviewed articles comparing DMT and near-death experiences. One, and if you talk in general terms and you say, okay, what is a near-death experience like? Well, okay, well, it's a very realistic experience. You believe it's real. You believe that it can be life transforming, and that you realize there's something more to life. Maybe it did put you on the other side to a certain extent, because some people who are atheists take DMT and become believers that there's something else out there. So it's a very realistic experience. That makes it similar in that sense to a near-death experience. You see sentient beings on the other side in both experiences. And so some people will give these very general categories and say, hey, it's really the same thing. So you can do this with drugs. But when you get into the comparison, like in the one of the peer-reviewed articles compared what sentient beings are we seeing in a near-death experience and what sentient beings are you seeing in a DMT experience? Very different. In a DMT experience, you're much more likely to see clowns, talking insects,
Right.
aliens that you're conversing with. Very rarely are you going to talk about spending time with a deceased relative. Near death experiences, almost exclusively, you're seeing deceased relatives, not living relatives. You're seeing uh, angels, God, Jesus. This is very consistent. So it's really very different. And I mean, in a near-death experience, you have this series of things that we've already mentioned, where you feel like you've come out of your body. You're looking down on your body. You realize, oh my goodness, that's my dead body down there. And then you begin visiting with God, or talk to Jesus, or talk to someone on the other side, deceased relatives. You may have a life review. But then I would just urge anybody who thinks this is the same thing to go look at a bunch of near-death experiences as shown in the best research, not just anything coming over the internet, and then go look at a bunch of experiences of people who've taken DMT. They're seeing
Right.
geometric figures. They're seeing all kinds of wild stuff. It sounds very much like what you'd see in a hallucination. They vary greatly from one to the other. Very different. It's kind of like me saying, I throw things in the kitchen sometimes, and Tom Brady throws footballs on a football field. It's really the same thing. Well, no, it's not really this. Yes, you could say, okay, both of you are moving your arm, something comes out of your hand, and yes, there are parallels, but we aren't doing the same thing.
Right.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
hallucinations. Sorry, I got that word wrong.
Hallucinogenic drugs, hallucinations, they're
That's
all
an
hard to grasp.
objection. That's an objection that you brought up Dr. Gary Habermas. That's an objection that people pose to him about the resurrection, and he points out that that doesn't really work because these are shared experiences, and you don't get that when you're taking hallucinogenic drugs.
Right.
So I guess another question that I have is that Christianity, I believe, is unique. Well, you'd be the one to ask about this. Is Christianity unique in that there is also an alternative destination, eternal destination? And so if that would be true, which we know that's true, what would you say about an experience with more like a demonic or a dark experience, or what somebody might call a hellish? I'm sure you probably use a different term for that. Do we find those out there?
Distressing or hellish experiences, yes. And sometimes they're actually called both of those things by both secular and spiritual researchers. But no, that's not unique to Christianity. I mean, you go into Hinduism, and a lot of different belief systems will talk about a judgmental experience on the other side, as well as a paradise or something on the other side. But yeah, that's an interesting one. Raymond Moody in 1975, when he published his book, acknowledged that some of them were not all happy experiences, that they were distressing. He surmised that perhaps these were people who had tried to commit suicide, and maybe that was relegated to that group of people. After that, people like the physicians who were doing studies didn't tend to find distressing experiences, so they were just kind of ignored as maybe that was a hallucination or something different from a near-death experience. And a lot of people were saying they're all positive, really. But one cardiologist, Dr. Rawlings from Chattanooga, Tennessee, was reviving someone, and the person would say as he revived him, "Do not let me lapse back onto the other side, because every time my heart stops, I go back into hell." And he would revive him, then he would go back, revive him, and he would go back. This uh, Rawlings might have been kind of a lukewarm believer at the time, but this shook him up. The person was so sincere. He was experiencing something horrible. It shook him up. So Dr. Rawlings began to talk to other patients and talk about what he actually saw when they were dying. Now, his wasn't a very scientific study, so a lot of people don't take him that seriously. But he was a very respected cardiologist. In fact, he was a cardiologist at the Pentagon and talked to future presidents and people about, or were their personal physician or cardiologist. So he's very well respected. But he felt like if you really talk to people right when they were having these experiences, that up to 50% of the experiences were negative. Why wouldn't they be reported? People, if you think that it's hard for people to share about their near-death experience with their physicians and relatives, think how much harder it would be to talk about a hellish experience. I mean, that throws your whole character and everything into question, and it's a terrifying, terrifying experience. But since then, some good books have been published by people. Blessing in Disguise is one of my favorites, by Dr. Romer, Rommer. And what I like about her book is she gives a lot of the actual experiences so that you can look at them and say, what are they all about? But the person, sure enough, comes out of their body, believes that they're on the other side. It's during a clinical death or some type really close to death experience. They may see demonic figures that are lying and laughing and telling them that their life was never real, that it was just all a big joke and that they don't exist, nobody around them exists. They're taking them down to some place of punishment. Often they're not really experiencing the punishment themselves, but they're seeing other people being punished. It might even be that they had an experience where they went to the other side and saw Jesus, and Jesus said, I want to show you the other side. And they just get a glimpse of the dark side of what could happen. But there are a lot of consistencies there, and people like Romer I believe it was Romer, it may have been another book on it, that they believe that it may be up to 20% of the near-death experiences are actually negative. They are terrifying. So I didn't want to study those because frankly they gave me the creeps, and most of them were not negative. And but in my comparing Christianity to that, I felt like I really needed to get into that area. So I'd actually devoted 3 chapters to the distressing experiences. So my conclusion is, yes, they're real experiences. There may be a Christian that has that experience because I think people are given the experience that they need. If a person is lukewarm and not living a consistent life for their faith, they may be shown the other side in order to realize this is serious. You need to get serious about your faith. Some people who are atheists go to the other side and meet a very loving God. Now, they're not told that their atheism is the way they should be living or that their character is the way they should be living. Why would an atheist see a loving God? Well, according to Christianity, God loves the world.
Amen.
It's not his will that any should perish, but that all should come to know him. And how does he want people to come to him? Not being scared into the kingdom, typically. He wants people on the other side. If I understand God's end game, he wants people who've chosen to love him. So according to the Apostle Paul, the kindness of God leads us to repentance. So shouldn't he want, let's say a person's an atheist because someone dear to them died. They can't reconcile that with the goodness of God, so they hate God and eventually just dismiss God from their consciousness. Well, maybe God's reaching out to that person saying, listen, I love you. I care. Seek me. And then they realize there's a loving God over there. And if they seek him, I think they'll fill in the gaps and become and understand enough in order to be saved. So to me, it's very consistent that both the good and the evil would actually see typically a loving God on the other side. And when they do experience the negative experiences, it's not that God's up there wailing on them. It's that they find themselves in a place where seemingly God is absent. And maybe God would reach down in that experience, and if they look up and call out to them, they would be pulled out of that experience. I've seen experiences such as that.
Yeah, it's a promise that's made in Jeremiah 29, that if you seek me with all of your heart, I will be found by you. So, the good news on Christianity is that God has made a way through faith that all can be reconciled. And so nobody has to experience those things eternally if they would just, believe that Jesus is who he claimed to be.
And as Jesus put it, seek and ye shall find. And
Amen.
that in the original Greek is a Greek present tense, which is more quality of action than time of action. So seek and keep on seeking. For me, when I went through my periods of doubt, it wasn't that I would just cry out to God and boom, I have belief. I couldn't force myself into belief, but it took a lot of seeking in prayer, making sure that my heart was open to whatever God told me, making sure I was sincere. Jesus said, if anyone is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching, whether it is from God or whether I'm just speaking of myself. So I had to make sure my heart was willing. And then I studied out the evidence, which I believe is very consistent with the New Testament. Paul was continually giving people evidence that what he was saying was true.
And it sounds like, I'm wondering your opinion on it, Steve. It sounds like the Apostle Paul himself had a near-death experience. He was caught up to the third heaven, it sounds like. I'm curious as to your thoughts or opinion on that, Steve.
Well, we know there were certain times when he was close to death. He was persecuted so much, thrown into prison, stoned, a day and the night in the deep. He had a lot of experiences where he could have been near death. 2 Corinthians 12, this may have been a near-death experience. We don't know. He doesn't tell a lot about it, but he says there was this time, and he calls it, at one point, he calls it heaven. Another point, he calls it paradise. So it was something on the other side, like people claim to experience. He said, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Could have been either one. But he's experiencing something as if, okay, he's really there. He's experiencing it. And there's an ineffability to it, where he talks about not being able to fully explain it. Well, that's one of the typical characteristics of a near-death experience is ineffability. So you often see people now if they say they had a life review, I believe they know for sure they had a life review. But when they talk about things like, oh, I could see this event in my life as if I were that other person receiving what I was saying or doing to them, that's kind of hard to explain because we don't have that experience in this life. Or if they're talking to people mind to mind, or if they're seeing colors they've never seen before, it's kind of like those people who are born blind. How do they explain what they saw when they have nothing to compare to it? The Apostle Paul seems to be experiencing some of that in that experience that he relates.
Everything you're saying, Steve, in terms of the overwhelming evidence for these near-death experiences and these deathbed experiences are as close to a falsification of naturalism and atheism that I've ever seen. I'm not convinced by the objections or the rebuttals from the skeptics to everything that you're describing.
Well, that's where I've come to. And in fact, it's sort of the icing on my apologetic and philosophical cake. When you look at the historicity of the New Testament, I think, as Gary Habermas and others argue, I think there are very strong arguments for the case that these New Testament documents are accurate. But when you can add to that I've got a person, and I've found 3 or 4 so far, people that I was talking to in my local churches when I would say, oh, I'm studying this. And they would say they saw Jesus on the other side. One in a visionary experience when he was going through some doubts and Jesus revealed himself to him. Another with a person who was in a sepsis condition where he had gone down into a comatose situation and he spent time with Jesus there. Now, these are people both in their 60s and 70s, I would assume. One, a very successful businessman, helps banks with their investments, very intelligent people. And these intelligent people that I have every reason to trust, and they have no reason to be lying to me, are telling me they saw Jesus and are absolutely sure of it. It happened decades ago, and they're tearing up and can hardly get through the testimony to me. It's not something that they're running around on the speaking circuit talking about. They probably hadn't told hardly anybody in the church about it, but they're telling me, and I'm evaluating this like you would in a legal context when you're evaluating testimony. There are reasons for this person to not share it with me. I think they just shared it with me because I said I researched this stuff, and they're telling it to me, and I'm saying, here's somebody that I know and have every reason to trust, and they're telling me they saw Jesus and talked to him, and they're sure of it. They're so sure about it that they're tearing up about it, and it impacted their lives, which again gives evidence that, just like the Apostle Paul, why do we think he had that vision? Total turnaround from killing Christians to going with the side to where he's going to be persecuted for the same
Right.
thing. So when you see this with near-death and death, near-death experiences, because they got more life to live, when they have these total life turnarounds, something is going on. So to me, when you talk about the historical evidence for the resurrection, I think we've got some very strong historical evidence there. But if you still have people today who are seeing Jesus that I trust, to me, that throws another layer of evidence on top of that. I'd gotten to where in academia, I was sure there was a God. I thought there was plenty of evidence for the existence of God. I was pretty up to 75 or 80% on the Jesus thing, but hey, that's historical. 2,000 years since all that happened. I'm pretty sure, but I was a little bit uncomfortable doing these worship songs where you're actually worshiping Jesus, you know? But when I started talking to people who had had these experiences with Jesus, wow, that just put my faith at a new level. And this is the best place I've been evidentially in my entire life. And I'm turning 67 this year, and I just feel so comfortable with the faith. And I'm the type guy who I read Shermer, I read The New Atheist, I read all the other side of things, and I'm just convinced that the great majority of them haven't even studied this stuff. They'll
Right.
argue very authoritatively like they know this is not true. And then you look at their endnotes, their footnotes, and it's like, have you even read any of the evidence?
Yeah. They don't really
Really? It's shocking. I don't know how much y'all have read, but it's
very
just
surface
shocking
level.
how little that Richard Dawkins.
Yeah.
And
it's bad.
where have you even read the other side? I don't think so.
Well, that's why we need to get you, brother, on a podcast like Joe Rogan in order to go over all this amazing evidence for the legitimacy of these near-death experiences. Because when he has people like Michael Shermer on, their objections or their alternative hypotheses, as you've demonstrated here today, simply don't work. They're unconvincing. They're surface level. They're one-dimensional is what I've found. And Steve, we've had a lot of excellent audience engagement. This has been extremely edifying, not only to us as hosts, but also the audience. And we have several interesting questions that have come in that relate to a lot of the questions that Sam and I put together as well. So I thought maybe we'll put a couple of these up here for you to interact with. And so this question comes in from Travis Statham. And his question is this: do exceptions to the rules for NDEs? So Steve, this goes back to what we were discussing closer to the beginning of the program. And so he's wondering if these exceptions prove anything interesting, like do NDEs and non-Christian theists lead to convincing, irrefutable evidence for those deities?
Yeah, we did discuss this. I'll add to that and say that there's often a problem with some of the research that goes on in other cultures, and that sometimes it's not an apples to apples comparison. So that, for example, one study that somebody did of visionary experiences in the Middle Ages. And some of them would talk about purgatory and other things. And they'd say, okay, well, there we go. Depending on your culture, that's going to determine what people are seeing in their near-death experiences. But these were experiences that they were quoting that had survived through time. Not a cardiologist looking at people and finding out what the core experience actually is during that time. So if you're in a primarily Catholic culture in the Middle Ages, which of these experiences are going to get repeated in sermons and in talks? It's going to be the ones that show the Catholic distinctives, right? But it may be the anomalous experiences that are getting passed down. The same thing is happening on the internet today. Some people just go onto YouTube and start looking at a whole bunch of interesting experiences. Well, which are the ones that YouTube will bring to the top of a search? The most interesting that the most people have clicked like on. If you're just doing the core experience over and over and over, that doesn't become interesting. What's the most interesting are the anomalous experiences, right? And so you do have these experiences where people are saying, oh, this person went to the other side, and they were told, they knew on the other side that all religions were wrong, or all religions are right. Those are the type ones that'll raise to the top. Things about reincarnation. I found very few near-death experiences where people are reporting reincarnation. That's an anomalous experience. And yet, if you look at it on YouTube, that may be the majority of them, because those are more interesting than the core experience. So in international studies, for example, they used to say early on that people in India did not experience a tunnel. So this must be an American thing. Well, that's possible. I doubt there really is a physical tunnel. We're in a spiritual dimension on the other side, incorporeal. I think a tunnel, even if you look at Western reports, is just it's a visual that God gives you to say you're traveling to another dimension. And some even over here will see themselves going up an escalator or something different. Well, in other cultures, you may communicate that in a different way, going over a bridge, for example, and that's fine.
Right.
That's not contradictory. Same thing with God. If you're just pulling up things from the past that people have passed down, you may see a blue God or one with many arms or whatever, but you're not comparing apples to apples. So what I did is go into the NDERF site, NDERF, where people turn in their experience, and they have well over 5,000 experiences. Not all of these are near-death experiences, but I appreciate it that Dr. Long allows anything to go up so that nobody can accuse him of sifting through and leaving the ones that he likes. So you have to be very careful. There are going to be a lot of anomalous experiences there. But I went to see what's the typical Muslim experience, for example. And you could narrow down in a search on his site countries that are primarily Muslim, people who claim to be Muslim. And when you look at them, there were hardly any of these who claimed to have seen Muhammad. I don't believe I found any like that. So, so when you're talking about irrefutable evidence for these other deities that are niche deities, they're not just talking about seeing the Almighty God. They're talking about, ooh, I saw this niche deity. I'm just not seeing that in the core experience, even though studies have been done globally.
I love how these anomalous experiences, Steve, are just that. They're anomalies, they're exceptions to the rule. It's the rule that supports the biblical Christian worldview. And in my opinion, that shows the weakness of this typical atheist objection, where they like to say, well, what about those of another religion, like those who hold to Hinduism? Does that prove irrefutably their religion? And you're showing no, that the niche experiences, if I'm understanding you correctly, brother, do not overturn the rule. It's the rule that points to what? Biblical Christianity as being the best explanation for what we see here.
Yes, and there may be, I'm not sure of this, there may be more in the Western world that are claiming to have seen Jesus than in other cultures. But that would be still consistent with the experience. That doesn't necessarily prove that Jesus is just a figment of their imagination or something that was brought over by expectations, because over and over and over, we found that it's not people's expectations that are causing the specifics of the experience. So, maybe Jesus is more likely to reveal himself to someone who already knows him to a certain extent. But we look broader at visions. We see a lot of visions of Jesus in Muslim cultures, and I've read books where people are reporting on this phenomenon that's going on, where people see the man in white and didn't figure out when they talk to other people that this was Jesus that they were seeing, totally unexpected, and visions by others who maybe were growing up Jewish and believed that Jesus was just another man, if not just a prophet. Why would they be seeing Jesus? So, so there's much that goes into this. You see, there's a lot of nuance that you have to go into,
Right.
which is why I've written well over 1,000 pages on it by now. My dissertation, the dissertation itself was 400 pages. So then I
Wow.
wrote 3 books on it.
Well, I greatly appreciate all the work and effort you've put into this topic, Steve, and that's why I recommend the chat. Do check out all your books and materials on the issue. And so this one comes in. This is an interesting one. It's a question based on a biblical objection that I've seen from certain people who hold to a specific theology. And so this comes in from Gavin Lockard, $5 soup chat. Appreciate the support. So he says, the Bible seems to say that the dead know nothing. I think he's pointing to Ecclesiastes, which describes everything under the sun, from my understanding. Nothing until Jesus comes back and resurrects humans. So if I could add a little context, I've seen some people argue for a position called soul sleep, Dr. Miller, where basically we don't go to heaven when we die. We sleep until the resurrection. And so a lot of people that hold to that specific theology, they are very skeptical of near-death experiences, I think, because of their presuppositions behind those ideas. And they'll look to arguments like this from Ecclesiastes. And so his question is this compatible with near-death experiences, Steve?
No, it's not compatible with those, because when you go to the other side and you're seeing a long deceased relative that's very much alive, and you're talking to that relative, that would not be consistent with soul sleep. And so I believe that the near-death experience, if you're just looking at it and believe nothing about the Bible, you would believe that, okay, people are conscious on the other side.
Right.
Now, that theology, I do believe that the passage he's referring to comes from Ecclesiastes. The passages they refer to, and they can sound quite persuasive if we just look at the passages that they use to try to confirm that doctrine. Jehovah's Witnesses believe this, for example. And in the Jehovah's Witness New World Translation, you'll see where Jesus is talking to the thief on the cross and says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And they punctuate it to where it's saying, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. Okay. Which makes it sound like that can be compatible with soul sleep, that he's not really going to see the thief on the cross today after they die, sometime in the future. But whatever the Jehovah's Witnesses do in their translation of the Bible, and I think it's recognized that that translation is not really a good translation from the original Greek. They don't even mention who did the translation. I don't know if they've discovered who did it or if it's been made public. But when it comes to a niche Jehovah's Witness doctrine, when you see those scriptures, they're translated in very unusual ways that you would normally not see them. So back to Ecclesiastes, saying that the dead know nothing or can teach nothing or these type things. Ecclesiastes, the context of Ecclesiastes is talking about life under the sun. In other words, let's look at life, Solomon says, as if all there is here.
Right.
Well, then life is meaningless. So he makes a lot of statements that seem bizarre to us if you don't understand the context. You know, it's all meaningless. Why?
Vanity.
Because no matter what we accomplish, no matter what Solomon did with all his wealth, it's just going to be gone. And Solomon loves teaching others his wisdom. When you're dead, you don't teach others your wisdom anymore here on earth. When you're deceased, there's so many things that you can't do. What is he talking about? On earth. Well, the dead know nothing on earth. And so the great scholars and the people who are completely foolish and never learned anything in life, it just evens the playing field. It doesn't matter anymore. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, he says, if life is just under the sun. So he's not talking about the afterlife, what these people can experience. And I think when you compare this to very clear scriptures like Jesus' transfiguration, now, if the dead are all in soul sleep, how is Jesus communicating with the long deceased Moses and Elijah? Well, that has to be an exception to the rule. I
Right.
really believe the only translation that makes sense of the context and the grammar when Jesus is speaking to the thief on the cross is he's saying, every translation will say something of this nature except the Jehovah's Witness translation. Today you'll be with me in paradise. Why would he say, I say to you today? Well, of course you're saying it today. When else would you be saying it except right now? You know, that's just not a phrase that's used. So it's so today you will be with me in paradise. He didn't say, well, today you're going to die at some future time when we have the future resurrection. I'll see you on the other side. He says, today you'll be with me in paradise. So I think it's very evident that in the Revelation, he has a vision. It's the souls of the martyrs are crying out to him. They seem to be very much alive on the other side. So, so I just disagree with that theology. And I do think it contradicts what we see in near-death experiences.
It does. And that's an excellent answer, Dr. Miller. I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Why is $5 by his name? Is that a $5 question or?
It is. And you gave more than a worthy response for the $5 question, Dr.
No,
Miller.
I'm not demeaning that question at all. I was just, I'd never seen that before on the thing, but no, that's a very good question. And there is a strain within Protestantism where that had become quite popular. So I have that doctrine became quite popular. And so I've talked to a lot of people in that regard. Excellent question. Thank you.
Isn't there now a challenge to those that hold to soul sleep to engage in a sophisticated and meaningful manner this evidence for near-death experiences? Because this evidence really does contradict, as you said, the doctrine of soul sleep. But you've explained a great amount of passages that they use, like those in Ecclesiastes. Am I correct to say, Dr. Miller, when Paul says that he's absent from the body, I say and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord, is that saying that when we die, our body goes into the ground, waits for the resurrection, glorification, and our spirit, our regenerated spirit, goes to heaven, goes to the third heaven to be with God?
That's the way I'm taking that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the sleep, when they say, well, the Bible talks about sleep, is that referring to our bodies sleeping until the first resurrection when we're glorified, the redemption of our bodies?
I'd have to go back and look at all the passages that are talking about us sleeping, but I think that's just an analogy or a way of expressing death. When somebody dies and you go see them in their casket, they look like they're asleep. And so sometimes when they're speaking of death, they're speaking of them sleeping. They're not making a statement as to where their spirit is or what's going on. They're merely saying, okay, he's asleep, meaning death.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it with Revelation 6, the souls under the altar they don't sound like they're asleep. They sound like they're fully conscious. So I appreciate that, Steve. Again, we've had some excellent interaction with the chat. People are loving this. I think you're going to be a fan favorite now, Steve. And so
I'm honored.
And I know you're a fan favorite on other channels too. I really enjoyed, and Sam has as well. We've discussed your interviews with Sean.
Well, thanks so much
McDowell.
for everyone tolerating my Southern accent. I've never been able to get rid of it, so it keeps me humble.
You're doing great, brother. And so, Sam, did you want to do the honors and go over this question, brother? I think this is a good one here.
Yeah. So the question from Travis, he says, brain function dives after 20 seconds, but mitochondria would have several minutes of energy. No, I guess he's asking you. I guess he's asking if the mitochondrial energy in the brain would still be there after the death of brain function,
or and possibly saying that if brain function dies after 20 seconds, so if the mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of the cell, so it gives us energy, helps with energy production. Maybe they're trying to say, well, that's several minutes of energy that's still there. The atheist might say is enough to give us these hallucinations and life experience. It might seem like a long time, even though it's a few minutes. Steve, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Travis. Because that has come up in recent years. There was an article in The Guardian which quoted a study which was claiming this very thing, that was claiming that some people who, for example, had been on life support, but they gave up on them ever regaining consciousness, and so they pulled the plug, and then they had charts of what their heart was doing and what their brain activity was, because they were actually hooked up to machines during that time. So they were saying, hey, we can tell what happens after death because these people were actually hooked up at the time. Well, that should be compared to the Pam Reynolds case that I mentioned earlier, where everything was flatlined when she had her experience. So that could not have been her case, that anything going on within the cells would have been causing a conscious experience that was hyper conscious, not just conscious, but also laying down memories. In her case. Okay, so what about these other cases? Well, somebody did a good job, and I'm sorry I don't have it in front of me, but on a blog, pulled together, okay, what was this study that people were referring to, and what did it actually find? And their claim, and I mean, they actually had the charts from the EEG and all these other things up there. But what they found was, what happened was exactly what you'd expect. This person was pulled off life support. When they were pulled off, their heart continued to occasionally beat once. Every time it beat once, there was a little bit of rise in the activity in the brain. Now, this was not a coming enough to produce full consciousness and the person talking or gasping for breath or anything, but the body is trying to keep itself going. It's used to breathing and the heart beating. So occasionally there would be a heartbeat, and again, you would see some kind of latent activity. The cells don't die totally during and finally during clinical death. There will be some kind of latent activity, I'm sure, in there. The question is that enough to bring about consciousness? And if you talk, in fact, Van Lommel in his study, he's got at least one chapter talking about what happens to the brain during clinical death. And it's just not enough to cause a full resuscitation or to lay down memories. So if you need that, I'm at jstevemiller@gmail.com. If that concerns you, email me, and then I can look up this blog that really had a lot. This was a long post, and it will give you a lot of details to look at as counter evidence. But I appreciate you bringing that up. It was in The Guardian. A lot of people talk about it, but this person seemingly has gotten down to the root of what they were talking about and debunked some of the things that were said.
And it doesn't really address a lot of what you've discussed here and on other podcasts and in your books, Dr. Miller, correct me if I'm wrong, the experiences that comprise people being able to. So one experience that comes to mind, I might not reiterate it perfectly, but you were speaking about it with Sean McDowell in a recent program that you did just a couple of weeks ago. It was really good. I recommend people check it out. And you guys were discussing, I believe, an experience where I think it was a woman who left her body in a hospital room, and she was able to describe all the tools that were being used, the detail. Are you able to speak to that a little? I mean, how would...
Well, that's the Pam Reynolds case I was referring to earlier, and it's in Dr. Sabom's second book, and he gives a whole chapter to this. It's called Light and Death. Dr. Michael Sabom, S-A-B-O-M, and he's the one who did the research for it. But yes, she was able to describe minute instruments. And Dr. Sabom, he's such a stickler for detail that he said, okay, I've never heard of it. She was talking about something that they were using that looked, it was kind of shaped like a toothbrush and this and that.
Right.
And he thought, I don't know what she's talking about. I've never used an instrument like this. So he sends off for the spec sheet on the thing and talks to the doctor who did the surgery. And he gets the spec sheet and looks over. He said, yeah, I could see her seeing that. How in the world? I mean, her eyes were taped shut. So yeah, okay. Again, the brain function dives after 20 seconds, even if you have something going on there in the cells to keep them alive. This is not explaining full consciousness, but it's for certain not explaining how Pam Reynolds could tell what those instruments were and what was going on in the hospital setting. This is just astounding stuff that makes a chill go down your spine. And it doesn't explain what happened in my cousin Bucky's case, because his brain was not dying. This was not a dying brain situation. Why would he all of a sudden be able to have paranormal abilities to know what was going on with his dad 2 hours away at the time of his death? That doesn't make sense. And shared death experiences where, for example, I was at at MD Anderson, probably the top cancer clinic in the world. My brother's getting treatments there. Please pray for him. But it's my brother Richard, and he mentions to the nurse, have you seen any of these experiences that my brother studies? And she said, I used to work in an emergency room or critical care area, and this little girl had been terribly burned, and her heart stopped, and people were rushing in trying to resuscitate her. But she said she saw the girl's spirit just lift up out of the body. And she said, a chill goes down she's pointing back. She said, a chill runs down my spine, when I talk about this or when I experience it. She said, I hadn't told it to hardly anybody, but except my mom, I think she said. But I saw it come out, and it was not a charred look. It was just a perfect body, dressed in white, beautiful, lifting up out of her body. Well, that can't be explained by something going on in a dying brain, because that nurse's brain was not dying. So when you get into these supernatural type things that we're seeing happen repeatedly during these experiences, none of this stuff about the mitochondria is giving a sufficient explanation.
Wow.
It almost seems like the question is trying to conflate the cells of the brain and say those are identical to the brain. But if that's the case, then there wouldn't be a difference between a live brain and a dead brain. Maybe.
I'm not sure where to go with that. The brain has a lot of mystery to it.
Yeah.
But I think, if we know anything from personal experience, I can know what my wife's saying when she's next to me. But if she's next door, I don't know what she's talking about. I don't know what the neighbors are talking. There are limits to our physical sensory devices like the ears and the eyes. I for sure don't know what's going on in another country. Now, there are experiments that try to see, can people understand? And maybe there's specially gifted people but a lot of those experiments, I'm just not convinced by them. Even if there is a special person with special gifts that can just know these things that are going on, like can know what cards somebody's doing in another room, typically when you see those, they'll say, there are more than chance would have guessed, and it's like a 60% accuracy. And you're like, okay, yeah, but if you do 1,000 of those experiences, some of them, just by the odds, are going to come out with higher than average. But that means 40% of them were wrong, even in those best case scenarios. But none of these experiments were showing that all of us have this ability. If anything, it's certain very gifted people. So why would we suddenly near death be able to know that somebody had died? Or how would a person who's not ill know that they're just about to die? And this is quite common.
And I've heard you discuss stories, I think it was with Sean McDowell, where a person in near-death experience comes back and mentions a sibling that they didn't know that they had because their parents didn't tell them about that sibling. Or they say they met their biological father, but their parents did not tell them that they were adopted. I mean, how do you explain these situations?
Yeah, those are hard to explain. And as I say, people like Shermer are going to say, well, when you got millions of experiences, somebody is going to experience that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that was supernatural. Or I would say, go back to those studies like that Henry Sidgwick and others did of surveying 17,000 people and finding that 10% of them had seen they had seen someone who was not physically there, and then they find out that, oh, that was someone who just died that they didn't even know was sick. How did they get that knowledge? Well, that's a bigger study that can't be explained just by chance anomalous happenings.
Yeah.
Here's a question that I've had on my mind, and since I have you here, Steve, I wanted to ask you, do you think the occurrence of near-death experiences are more prominent and prevalent now more than any time in history because of the technological advances and the sophisticated nature of medical equipment and being able to bring people back to life after their heart has stopped? Where in the past, we weren't sophisticated or technologically savvy enough to do that. Steve, any thoughts on that?
Yes, I believe that is the case, and that's why cardiologists can study these now and get enough of the experiences to see, is it really a chance thing? Because I think it wasn't until the 1950s when they started perfecting these resuscitation techniques. And so now you do, now still the great majority of people who have a cardiac arrest don't come back. But a percentage of them, they can resuscitate, and these people you can go and ask what happened during your resuscitation. So yes, now we have larger sets that we can deal with who've actually experienced clinical death. Before, they've been reported in all cultures, and I think almost all cultures, at least. A lot of cultures out there, but globally. And a fellow named Shushan, a really good researcher, has studied them in the earliest civilizations, found reports of them there, and in indigenous tribes like American Indians, when people first started talking to them. And they'd ask them, whereas anthropologists used to typically say, and skeptics particularly, well, the reason people believed in the afterlife and stuff is they just didn't really know science. They were pre-scientific, so they would see the leaves moving, but nothing moving it, so they would think the air was somehow something spiritual going on. But now they know better. Well, actually, what Shushan found is that when these people were taught to in these indigenous cultures and earliest cultures, when you ask them why they believed in an afterlife or God, often they will talk about the visionary experiences that had been happening within their tribe. And they believed the people because there wasn't a good reason for them to be lying to them. And so these were going on, but it was all sporadic. But now that we've got resuscitation techniques, we can see them in much greater numbers than we could before.
What an amazing time we live in. It's almost as if God
Yes.
has given us another overwhelming piece of evidence for his existence in order that we are without excuse. And it's not that we need it. The Bible is enough. We have faith, but it is nice that we have this information to help show us that no, biblical Christianity is true. It's not a blind faith. It's a faith that's supported by real empirical scientific evidence. Because Steve, aren't a lot of these cases, a lot of what you're discussing. It's in the peer-reviewed literature, in these medical journals of doctors.
Yes,
You've talked about
and
cardiologists.
because if you think about it, this is a very practical question that doctors and nurses need to deal with. So it's primarily now, interestingly, it's not much in the theological journals. And that's what I'm trying to do now. Is I went to the Evangelical Philosophical Society annual meeting and presented a paper last November. I'll be presenting one in a regional conference. I'm trying to get theologians interested in this because this has a lot of relevance to mind-body dualism and so many of the questions we deal with today. It's not the theologians that were studying this stuff. I think we thought this was kind of new agey stuff and just stayed away from it. I never thought there was anything there because typical apologetics books didn't cover it from the 70s until now. Now you do have Gary Habermas, J.P. Moreland, and some others who are digging more into these things and give it some legitimacy. But it's mostly coming out of the secular universities, people seeing an experience that they've got to find answers to. And it's mostly in medical literature, because when a nurse is and you have hospice and geriatrics who are dealing with the dying, and so it's a very practical question to say, okay, you're dealing with a person as a hospice nurse who is dying, and this person begins to say, I'm talking to my deceased relative over here in the corner. Okay, do you adjust the morphine? Do you tell them, oh, well, you've been through a lot, and just kind of ignore the situation? Or is this something that's so real to the person and is so normal that you need to understand that maybe this is not a physical thing at all? Maybe this is a very real experience that should be taken seriously. So it's a legitimate area of study for people that are in the medical field. And I didn't mention near-death experience is 4%, but some people in recent years have been studying deathbed visions in a hospice unit in New York. And when they talk to the residents each day and ask them if they've had any of these visionary experiences, over 80% of them are reporting those. Now, maybe if they go comatose and then have the experience, maybe all of them, maybe this is intrinsic to dying. So it's not just the 4% of near-death experiences, but lots of people, if you've been around the dying, they start saying things. And I'll have friends that are very secular that I'll tell them what I'm studying. They'll say, well, let me tell you about when my mom died. I always thought maybe it was a hallucination, because they looked beside them in the room and started talking to their deceased husband or wife. But then when you find it in great numbers, you say, well, wait a minute, this is a lot like a near-death experience. But if it's just something physical, why aren't they experiencing life reviews? I don't think I've ever seen a life review in a deathbed experience. Why? Well, they don't need a life review because their life's over. They're gonna have their life review at the final judgment. They can't really change anything about that. But I think that gives them an opportunity to get things right at the last. And as we said earlier, God doesn't want any to perish. He may give a lot of people a last minute experience to kind of complete their faith before they go to the other side.
Wow. Amazing stuff, Dr. Steve.
It is amazing.
It really is. It's a great time to be a Christian, a biblical Christian, my brother. And I've really been looking forward to this program, and you did not let us down. Sam and I, we've had an epic time interviewing you, engaging with the chat, and time has flown by. We could speak to you all night, but I do want to respect your time. And so let's allow Sam, my award-winning co-host, as we like to say, brother. That award should be in the mail anytime now. Sam, any final words, final thoughts, even a final question that you had as we start to wind things down here?
Can I give over thought?
Of course, yeah.
Earlier, you made the statement about the Bible ought to be enough. I think sometimes we get a little more spiritual than the Bible, and you can't get more spiritual than the Bible. And the Bible itself, Jesus said, after he healed the child from afar, He said, unless you people see signs and wonders, there is no way you're going to believe. Now, that's a double negative in the Greek, which means there ain't no way you're going to believe. A double negative in the Greek adds power to it. Now, I used to think that he was kind of cutting them down and saying you ought to believe just because I said it by faith. But as y'all probably are very well aware, faith is in the New Testament is not a blind faith, but it was typically based on adequate evidence. So Jesus himself is saying, unless you people see, that's empirical, see signs and wonders, there's no way you're going to believe. So at least one group of people, maybe everybody, maybe he's talking about people in general, maybe he's talking about the people he was talking to, but there's at least some. I'm that type person, I think, that really needs solid evidence. And if you've got to see certain things in order to believe, that implies that it's not just a historical look at things past, but there need to be things going on now that if we're really searching, we can find around us. To me, these visionary experiences have given me those things that I have people trustworthy around me, at least one instance or something in every family where you can say, wow, I trust that person. And I believe that if I were the one having that experience and reporting it, I'd probably be saying the same thing they did. So that gives me another reason to believe. But go on, Sam. I'm sorry to preempt your final thought.
Actually, before you do, Sam, I did want to say, Steve, I think that's a fantastic point because you and I seem to have similar personalities where my journey into Christianity and as a Christian has comprised endless hours digging deep into challenges, objections, questions or arguments that skeptics of the Bible, skeptics of Christianity have put forth. And in seeking out answers to those problems, my faith has only been strengthened. Doubts have been removed. And it's because we have a faith that is backed up by so much incredible evidence, with near-death experiences just being another additional piece of evidence on top of all the evidence.
It's a part of a large cumulative case.
Amen. Amen, brother. I'm glad you pointed that out. It's very important. Sam?
Yeah, no, I 100%. I would agree. The Bible tells us to test all things, to test the prophets. There's a litmus test in Deuteronomy for a prophet, whether or not they're a true prophet, to test the word of God. We've had Lee Strobel on the show. That's an awesome interview, as well as J. Warner Wallace, both critics who have tested the biblical worldview and found out that the non-biblical worldview, that's the worldview that is wanting. And apologetics has definitely helped my walk with the Lord and reassure me in my faith. So, with that said, Donny, I want to thank you for doing what you do, and also you, Dr. Miller. It's been a pleasure for me to be here. And for any of the critics in the chat, I mean, I hope that this helps. This upload here is a stumbling block for your walk in the world. And then, yeah, I mean, there's no more important question than if Jesus Christ is who he claimed to be. Everything hangs on that question.
What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose or forfeit his soul?
Amen.
I mean, this is as important as it gets.
That's right.
And I was just shocked to find all this evidence and research that had gone on in the years that I'd never been exposed to. By the way, you mentioned Lee Strobel. He's coming out with his latest book next month, I believe mid-March. I believe the title is Seeing the Supernatural, but look it up. It's available for early sale. He actually interviewed me for his chapter on deathbed experiences in that.
Awesome.
So he's going to talk about near-death experiences, deathbed experiences, and I'm not sure what all else he covers, but a delightful person. He was just so humble and nice when we spent time together. I'm so glad that you mentioned Lee.
That's awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to that book. And I know people who might be new to you in our live chat over the last couple hours, they will be excited to check out all of your material here. So I have it linked in the live chat, but also in the description box for people to see. And so
Thank you so much.
Steve.
And if somebody doesn't have the money, or you're in a country where it's hard to get my books or something, I'm at jstevemiller@gmail.com. I can send you free PDFs of any of my books that might be helpful to you.
Oh, wow.
If I'd spent all this time working at Taco Bell, I would have made more money than trying to publish books. I published the books because this was fascinating material that needed to get out there. So I just want to get it into people's hands.
Wow, praise the Lord. I appreciate all the work you've put into this, Steve. It really is a topic that so to the skeptics and critics in our live chat, or anybody who's going to watch this into the future, I am somebody, and I know Sam is too. We've discussed this. We came into this as skeptics, but when I actually looked at it and looked into the material and the topic in an objective way, I came out expressing what I've been expressing today, that the evidence truly is overwhelming. And I am not convinced personally with the objections, counters, and criticisms to the evidence for near-death experiences, which is why I'm so thankful, Dr. Miller, for you and how comprehensive you were tonight. And so maybe people can look at this as a go-to program on near-death experiences. We also did one a month ago about Sam, right, with John Burke, who has also looked into this extensively. And so he's a blessing. You're a blessing, Steve. And your email, J. Steve Miller, you said?
The letter J, Steve Miller at gmail.com.
Okay. Okay. Let's get that out to people. And all right, Sam, appreciate you doing this. Steve, I know how busy you are, and so I appreciate you doing this as well. Is there anything you wanted to leave us with in terms of final words, final thoughts?
I think that's what this has done for me. I mentioned it to Sean the other day in his interview, that I've been studying signs and wonders, that phrase in the New Testament. And what I understand so far from looking at my Bible dictionaries, it's like a wonder is something that's astounding, something that's not expected in the normal course of things that happens. The kind of thing, and so what I've seen in near-death experiences, and like this nurse that shared with me in Houston a couple of months ago, and she's talking about the chill running down her spine. That to me is that aspect of wonder. Have you in your spiritual life had that experience, that sense of wonder that makes the hair stand on end or makes the chill run down your spine? I think that's a wonder. The sign part of it means that this is not just like if I saw a person who is 9 feet tall, that would be a wonder, but it doesn't necessarily point to anything spiritual. A sign and wonder means it's one of those astounding things, but it actually points to some spiritual reality as the cause or as a part of it. Signs and wonders. This has added the chill down your spine, hairs going up on your arm, part to my spiritual life that I think I was missing for a long time, and has so much solidified my faith, which is, as you say, it's a cumulative case of a lot of things. It took a lot of seeking through the years to come to this point, but this was kind of the icing on my evidential cake. And that's what I'd like to leave you with. This is important. This is so practical. It determines what you're going to do with your life, how you treat the people around you, how do you treat your spouse and your children. I've been through times in my life where the best I could do is just take care of them because of special problems. My first wife died of cancer. I was stuck with taking care of 4 boys. But you know what? Being a believer, it made sense to spend time with them. After all, whatever I do to the least of these, I've done to Jesus. This is very practical in determining how you live your life and living a life that truly counts. So I encourage people, do a little research into it, and I think this would be edifying and encouraging to you as well.
Wow, very powerful, Steve. That is amazing, and I too agree. This will be edifying, if not already edifying and encouraging to those that watch this. It's been encouraging to me. It's been encouraging to Sam. Steve, you mentioned your brother Richard earlier. We're praying for him.
Thank you so much.
Well. Yeah, no problem. God bless you, Steve, and what you're doing. I love the way you put it. This is icing on the evidential cake. And it really is, brother.
Has been for me.
Yeah, me too. So God bless you. This has been a great show. Time has flown by. To those in the audience, I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate all the interaction, engagement, questions, objections. We do like to engage and interact with the objections and criticisms. And so we appreciate you guys tuning in. Steve, we appreciate your time. And Sam, thank you for joining in as host tonight. With that, Standing for Truth is out. God bless all.